Finbank did come out as the second of several rescued banks to announce that it's in exclusive talks with a potential investor. Joining us in the studio to take a look at the whole process to sell the Nigerian banks is Kayode Akindele, like you mentioned, from Greengate Strategic Partners. Thank you so much for coming on to the show. Before we even delve on Finbank and, of course, Union Bank, which did announce earlier this week, let's look at the wider process to sell these banks. The governor was on CNBC yesterday, and he did mention that we are in the home stretch for this process. But however, I think some analysts still see some risk going forward. And one of the issues that many analysts have mentioned, of course, is the funding gap or a supposed funding gap for AMCON. But what are your thoughts on the risk going forward now?
I think the risk going forward, I think it's good that they now have a potential investor they're discussing with exclusively. But the risk is they have to come to an agreement. If you look at recently HSBC and Nedbank, over the discussions going forward, they fell apart. And you can't come to an agreement, especially on valuation, and how existing shareholders are going to be treated. I think that's going to be the major sticking point in most of these discussions. So we're close to the end, but I think this is a really difficult part now where two sides have to agree.
I think you've just made a very good point. It's really not a slam dunk. The fact that they are in strategic exclusive talks with these investors does not mean that a deal is going to come through, because indeed some of these investors might be looking at other rescued banks.
Exactly. I mean, many of the investors bidded for more than one bank. So it could be a position where a bank which they have is high on the priority list might become available to them, and they might switch. All right.
Okay, now let's take a look at the banks, of course, that have come out with announcements. Union Bank, what risk do you see particularly in Union Bank? The shareholding structure, can you give us some insight into how that might be an issue? Because at least on the legal side, it seems that there are less risks in that regard.
I think on Union Bank shareholding structure, the staff of Union Bank have, I think, about 5 or 6% of the shareholding, and they're quite vocal in their position in terms of the strategy and going forward of Union Bank. And in the last AGM which they had, most of the shareholders wanted Union Bank to remain an international bank. So that's reached the 50 billion naira threshold that CBN has put. Now, for any new investor coming in to be able to put in enough capital to go to reach that 50 billion naira stage is going to be quite difficult. But Union Bank is a historical bank. Originally was one of the tripods of banks that control the Nigerian banking sector, together with UBA and First Bank. So it has a legacy, it has a brand, and it has assets that are right now undervalued, but in the right hands could take it going forward.
And then let's, of course, look at Finbank. What risk do you see in the transaction there?
I think Finbank is one of the newer generation banks from the merger in 2005 with about 4 or 5 different banks. I think the plus point for Finbank is that they took an early lead in the electronic banking structure. So they have a decent electronic banking platform, which many see as the future of banking in Nigeria. And to take that forward, I think in terms of their branch structure, they have about 100 branches, which gives them a good foothold across the country, especially in the south and southeast. But I think going forward, trying to agree with all the different shareholders on the valuation of the bank is going to be another issue.
Well, I know many of the parties to this deals obviously have signed non-disclosure agreements, but it seems some information is trickling out. And we are hearing that FCMB might be the preferred bidder in the case of Finbank. But going forward now, what are the next steps? Because we know that AMCON has to get involved. Can you just summarize for us the next steps? Assuming, for instance, that these exclusive bidders are the ones that would do a deal with these banks, what's the next step going forward to finish this transaction?
Well, I think initially I'm a bit surprised that the stock exchange hasn't suspended the stocks, because we're in a position where they've made a public announcement about possible acquisition talks. So I'm surprised the stock prices have not been suspended. I think secondly, what's going to happen is that they're going to sit down with the board and discuss valuation of the banks according to the strategic investors' ideal valuation compared to the board's valuation. They also discuss on strategy going forward, because strategic investors are going to have a new strategy of how to take these banks forward, and it has to be tying with what the board thinks and existing shareholders think the bank is going to go forward. They also got to decide on AMCON, how much of the assets they're going to sell to AMCON, and how much of the new bank the existing shareholders are going to hold, because that is a big sticking point.
All right, we'll have to leave it there. Unfortunately, we can't take this much further, but everybody will be looking with bated breath to see how this plays out.